Hello again, and welcome to our final lecture on unemployment. Today we're going to talk about measuring unemployment. And unemployment, it's important to think about the definition. What does it exactly mean to be unemployed? Well, in most countries, it typically means those who are not currently employed and are also indicating by their behavior that they want to work at the prevailing wage and working conditions. So it's not just enough that someone's not working, they also have to be looking for work. In Canada, for example, they have a monthly survey. And so in most countries, they implement a monthly survey and ask workers, so they take a random sample of the population and ask workers about their working conditions in terms of whether they're working or not. So, for example, the labor force survey in Canada surveys people and categorize them as unemployed if they did not work but were actively searching for work. And they categorize people also as being employed if they did any work for pay. So obviously those who are employed plus those who are unemployed make up the labor force, and we looked at this in an earlier lecture on labor supply. The actual unemployment rate is defined as the proportion of the labor force that are unemployed. So in the US, for example, they do things very similar, but there are some subtle differences. So they do a random survey of the working age population, similar to the labor force survey in Canada. So again, in Canada, the labor force survey is a random sample of working age people. In the US, their sample is called the Current Population Survey, CPS. Now, some of the important differences relate to how they ask the questions. For one example, Canada treats those who are, Canada treats as unemployed those who engaged in any job search during the previous month. So it could even be a passive job search. So if they call the person and they said they're not working, but they're looking through the newspaper or on the internet for jobs, then they're considered unemployed. So in Canada, just looking at job ads is sufficient. But in the US, they actually have to apply for jobs. Okay? So to be considered unemployed, they need to be applying for jobs. Looking for jobs is not sufficient in the US. And so, of course, then that's going to reduce the unemployment rate in the US because there's going to be more people that would not be deemed unemployed. So the passive job search is a little more conservative in terms of deeming people unemployed. A study by Riddell in 2005 found that this difference in method could account for differences in the unemployment rate of 0.7 percentage points between US and Canada. Another difference between Canada and the US is the way the survey or the calculations based on the survey data treats those who are going to start a job in the short term. So in the US, since 1997, those not looking for work because they're going to be starting a job within the next month are no longer treated as unemployed in the US. So if you have a survey respondent and they said, I'm not working now, but within a month I'm starting a job. So in the US, those people would not be treated as unemployed because they're going to start a job. But in Canada, they continue to be classified as unemployed. And again, in the Riddell study, he finds that removing this group reduces the Canadian unemployment rate by about 0.2 percentage points. So if you recall from our earlier lecture, the labor force, so when we look at the entire population of a country, we first remove anyone that's not legally able to work, and then we're left with what's called the working age population, because most of the people that aren't legally able to work are children. Okay, there are some people who are in the military or who are in jail, but the vast majority are children. So we remove children under 15 years of age, and we're left with the working age population. Then from there, we remove people not willing or able to work, and we're left with the labor force. And the labor force consists of those who are employed and unemployed. Okay? And again, they need to be actively searching for work. Now, the working age population also, as I said, has people not in the labor force, and these are people who are not willing or able to work. So these are students, people who are retired, someone who's independently wealthy, discouraged workers. So if we look at the working age population as a whole, it's going to consist of the labor force, which consists of those employed and unemployed, and then also those not in the labor force. So those are people who are not willing or able to work, but they're legally able to work. Okay? And if you remember, the unemployment rate is just simply the number of people who are unemployed divided by the labor force. And then we multiply that by 100 to get the percent. Okay, so let's look at an example for Canada. I believe we looked at this before, but it's good to reinforce it. So in 2013, the total population, represented by this large box here, was 35.16 million. Now, if we remove people who aren't legally allowed to work, the majority of which are children, we are left with the working age population. And the working age population is about 28.67 million in Canada in 2013. Now, we want to remove those who are not willing or able to work. Okay, so people who are retired, wealthy, students, discouraged workers. So anyone who's just, for whatever reason, not willing to work, or if perhaps someone's disabled and they're not able to work because of their disability. So we remove them, and what we're left with then is the labor force. And in 2013, this was 19.08 million. So this is the labor force, and it can be broken down into the employed and unemployed. Okay, so the people who are unemployed must be willing and able, must be willing and able to work. So, so like we said, they must be actively searching for a job. So we wouldn't include discouraged workers here. So discouraged workers would be people who are not working, but they're not looking for work. Now, to calculate the unemployment rate, then here, we're going to take the number of people unemployed divided by the labor. So it's the proportion of the labor force that are unemployed. Multiply that by 100, and here we get 8.1% because we had 1.55 million people unemployed, and the labor force is 19.08 million. Now the participation rate is the labor force divided by the working age population. So it's the proportion of this big square here, the working age population, that are participating in the labor force, you could say. Multiply that by 100, and for 2013 in Canada, we get 66.16%. Okay, so these are how you calculate. So these are two very popular statistics, the unemployment rate and participation rate. Here are their formulas. And in 2013, they were 8.1% and 66%, respectively, in Canada. So there are certainly limitations to what this statistic can tell us. So the first thing that the unemployment rate doesn't tell us is how many discouraged workers there are. It doesn't say anything about the earnings levels of those who are actually employed. It doesn't say anything about the composition of those who are unemployed. And it doesn't say anything about whether the unemployed, maybe some of them also receive income support. Okay, and it doesn't say much about the fraction of the population that is employed. They could be underemployed. Perhaps the unemployment rate's really low, but people are working in jobs that aren't very good. So the quality, it doesn't say nothing about the quality of jobs that the employed actually have. Hidden unemployment, and we already have talked about this. It's basic. We're talking about discouraged workers. So it's individuals that will be without work, that could be without work, but yet they desire to work but are not classified as unemployed. So during recessions, there's few jobs available. The phenomenon of discouraged workers appears. Okay, because in a recession, it may, it's very difficult to get a job, so some people might give up. Discouraged workers are not employed and yet are not seeking work because they think that no work is available. So the number of discouraged workers would certainly increase in a recession when the opportunities for finding work can appear to be or are very low, and they become discouraged. In Canada, this is what the unemployment rate looks like from 1921 to 2010. This was the Great Depression. Okay, so this was a very difficult time in our history, and in most countries it was a difficult time. The unemployment rate soared to about 20%, and this was the result of the stock market crash in 1929. And you can see that actually it took quite a while for the unemployment rate to fall back down. So, we're talking almost over 10 years before the unemployment rate got to a level that was reasonable. Here are other recessions. The unemployment rate clearly here didn't go up as much as it did in the Great Depression. And here we have a sort of a boom period in recent decades. So here the unemployment rate went down to just over 5% or around 6%. And then what happened is the financial crisis, the global financial crisis that started in the US. This had the potential of being just as bad as the Great Depression, but there are many different, the government responds to a downturn much differently than it did in the Great Depression. And luckily, our unemployment rate only went up to 8.3%. Now, it's important to realize that the unemployment rate that we just looked at is Canada-wide, okay? Now, the unemployment rate can be quite different when we're looking at different groups or different geographic regions. The unemployment rate across the provinces is quite different, as we can see here. In Newfoundland, the unemployment rate is much higher than the other provinces generally. In Ontario, it's quite low. Manitoba, it's quite low. So you can see it's quite different across the provinces. So this could be difficult for policy at the country level because there could be some provinces that have very low unemployment rates, and if you stimulate demand even more, you could cause inflation in those areas. And in some provinces, we may not have stimulated it enough. Now, now let's look at the three statistics that are quite popular. The two that we've learned are the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. The other one here is just the employment rate. So you would take those who are employed and divide it by the labor force. And here we look at them over time. Okay, and these are different areas where there might have been a recession. And anyway, so we're looking at the participation rate first, and if we look at that, we can see that there was a substantial increase in labor force participation since 1946. A good portion of this was women entering the workforce, and we can see here the employment rate went up to some extent. And one big difference is that we see that the unemployment rate was extremely low before the 1960s, and it seems to have increased generally since that period. Okay, And we also see here the rate of growth in employment was quite high up to the 1970s, and it's been somewhat low afterwards. So we have here that the unemployment rate seemed to increase after 1966, but the employment rate also rose. And basically, what's accounting for that is that the labor, labor force participation rate, so the denominator, actually increased as well. Okay. Now let's talk about this idea of a natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is basically the average rate of unemployment around which the economy fluctuates. Okay, so here you have the unemployment rate, right? It's up and down. The natural rate of unemployment is estimated to be here. So it's sort of you can think of sort of the long run, or it's sort of removing any of short run changes in the business cycle. You can also think of the natural rate of unemployment as what the unemployment rate would be if cyclical unemployment, which is unemployment due to the business cycle, so changes in aggregate demand, what it would be without that. Okay, so in a recession, the unemployment rate is going to be very high and above the natural rate, mainly because of cyclical unemployment. And in a boom, the unemployment rate should be close to the natural rate, and it can even fall below. So we're just going to develop a little model, a simple model of the natural rate of unemployment. We're going to assume that that L is the number of workers in the labor force, E is the number of workers employed, U is number of unemployed. We already know these. The unemployment rate is, of course, U divided by L. We're going to assume that the labor force is fixed exogenously, so we're just going to assume it's fixed. And during any given month, we're going to have a fraction of people who are employed becoming unemployed. So they're separated from their jobs. And we're also going to have a fraction of unemployed workers that find jobs. Okay? So S is the rate of job separations, and F is the rate of job findings. And we're, again, just assuming both are exogenous to the model. Now, the labor market is in a steady state or long-run equilibrium if the unemployment rate is constant. So you can think of the people who are becoming unemployed and finding jobs are somewhat similar, are similar, the actual rates. And so in a recession, this wouldn't necessarily be the case because there would be more people losing their jobs than finding jobs. So we're sort of thinking over the long term, absent of any of these short run fluctuations in the demand, or sorry, in aggregate demand, in the changes in the business cycle. What is this? What is the unemployment rate sort of fluctuating around? What's the long term trend? So we can apply this steady state condition by setting so these are the number of people who are separated from their jobs, so lose their jobs. This is the rate S, and then we multiply it by those that are employed. And then we're going to set that equal to those who are finding jobs, the rate of finding jobs times the number of people unemployed. Okay, so we're going to set these two equal, and so we're imposing that there's a steady state, and then we're going to solve for the unemployment rate, and that will be the natural unemployment rate. So we set these two equal. We know that E is equal to L minus U because we know that L is equal to E plus U, and so E is equal to L minus U. We're just moving that U over the other side of the equal sign. So we put that in, we multiply it out, we solve for our unemployment rate, which is U divided by L. Okay, so when we do that, we get that the unemployment rate is equal to the separation rate divided by the sum of the two. So it's the proportion of the sum of both of these rates that's attributed to separations. So that would be the unemployment rate. So suppose each month 1% of unemployed workers lose their jobs, so S equals 0.01, and each month 19% of unemployed workers find jobs, so F is equal to 0.19. Find the natural rate of unemployment. So we plug it into our formula and we would get 5%. Okay, obviously if this number is much higher, you're going to get a higher unemployment rate. And if this number is much lower, you're going to get a higher unemployment rate, natural unemployment rate as well. Okay. Now let's look at some data for Canada and just look at some of the reasons for why people become unemployed. So for example, let's look at the first row here. So in 2000, the year 2000, the national unemployment rate was 6.8%. Okay. Now, if we look at the percent that are job losers, we see that 29% of them were permanent and 7% were layoffs. So of the overall people who were unemployed, so of this, think of the portion of this unemployment rate, if you were to add these two together, 36% of that were because of people losing their jobs, like involuntary. Okay, and then the vast majority of that was permanent losses. Okay, so sometimes people get laid off, but they're going to go back to work in 2 months or a month. But in most cases, it was a permanent loss in jobs. Okay, so these people could be fired or laid off, but it's permanent. Now, 12% of that were job leavers. Okay, so these people who quit their job, maybe to look for another job, and 38% were due to new entrants and re-entrants. Okay, so these are people who are coming into the labor force or leaving the labor force, and so we can see that this makes up a lot of the is a major reason for the any unemployment rate at any given year. So new entrants and re-entrants into the labor force constitute a substantial portion of those who are unemployed. Okay, so now let's talk about the incidence and duration of unemployment. So the incidence of unemployment is the proportion of individuals who become unemployed in any period. Okay, so that's like the separation statistic we looked at earlier. It measures the probability of a member of the group becoming unemployed. Now, the duration of unemployment is the length of time spent in the unemployment state before obtaining employment or leaving the labor force. Okay, so this isn't the same as the stat we looked at before. This is a measure of the duration of unemployment. So it's how much time they've spent in the unemployment state. And so it measures the length of time the individual can be expected to remain unemployed. So we can look at we can basically say that the amount of unemployed is affected by both the incidence and duration. In fact, the unemployment rate can be obtained by multiplying the incidence times the duration if we're in a steady state. So here we look at the incidence and duration of unemployment by age groups and by gender. First thing to notice is that for men who are young, the unemployment rate is much higher. It's almost 3 times higher for men who are young, 15 to 24. So the incidence rate is very high. So there's a very high probability of them leaving jobs or becoming unemployed. And the duration is approximately 2.3 months. And the percentage that's unemployed for greater than 6 months in that group is 9%. Okay, now if we look at women, we get a broadly similar uh, feeling. Their unemployment rate here is a little bit lower than males. Their incidence rate is a little lower, and their duration is a little bit lower. And also, they're a little less likely to be unemployed greater than 6 months. But in comparison to the other age groups, the overall pattern is similar. If we look at people who are age 25 to 44, the unemployment rate is much lower. The incidence rate's much lower. However, the duration is higher, especially for those 45 years and older. The duration becomes much larger. So, when you're young, you're usually not as, you don't have a family. There's less constraints involved when you switch a job or change jobs. So you see a lot more uh, churning in terms of job changes and turnover. But as people get older and then become more established in their careers and they have families, you see that the unemployment rate is lower, and when they do become unemployed, the duration is much longer. Younger people, although they have a high unemployment rate, they have a high incidence rate, they're also not unemployed for that, for a long time, right? The number of unemployed for greater than 6 months is very low for young people. So but when you get older and you're in a career, your skills become more specialized, and sometimes it can be a little harder to find a job that you're looking for. Also, you may have and older people too, they might be more likely to have savings that they can rely on, and so their job search can be funded for a longer period of time, so they don't need to take the first job they can get. Young people are likely not going to have much savings, and they're going to need money right away, and so they will take whatever job they can get. They don't need to uh, spend a lot of time searching. So the unemployment rate is widely used as an economic indicator of the aggregate state of the economy. And every month these statistics are released by Statistics Canada, in the U.S. the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and these are closely watched numbers by traders, anyone who is investing, because they're a piece of information about the aggregate state of the economy. They tell us about the tightness and looseness of the labor market. They're a measure of the amount of unutilized labor supply, and of course, these numbers will increase in periods of low or negative economic growth. They are a bit of a lagging indicator of the economy, but in any case, they do give us some information. And there is a lot of other statistics that are released every month, like GDP, uh, retail sales. So this is just a little piece of information that many economists and traders and anyone involved in the in investments, mutual fund managers, they're looking for as much information as possible to know what to invest in, and this is just one piece of a bigger picture, but it's an important statistics that's looked at a lot. Of course, it also measures the extent of hardship in the economy, region, or time period. Okay, let's do some practice problems. So this is an easy one. So we have an economy with 25,000 adults, of which 40,000 are retired senior citizens, 20,000 are full-time college students, 120,000 are employed, 8,000 are looking for work, and 62,000 stay at home. What is the labor force participation rate, and what is the unemployment rate? Well, the first thing we'd like to know is what's the labor force here? Okay, so we have 120,000 are employed, 8,000 are looking for work. So that's telling me that that probably is what the labor force is, because it's equal to those who are employed and those who are unemployed but looking for work. So the labor force is going to be 128,000. Now, what is the working age population? Okay, so we have an economy with 250,000 adults. Oh, okay, so we're told that these are adults. We'll assume that the other small categories aren't in here as well, like being in the military or in jail. So, to me, given this information, I would think that the working age population would be 250,000. Okay, now we need to know what the labor force is. And to know what the labor force is, we need to remove people who are not willing or able to work. So we would want to remove senior citizens and we'd want to remove the students. Okay, now also we would like to remove any of these people who stay at home because they're also not willing or able to work. Okay, and so we would take 250,000 and subtract this 40,000, this 20,000, and this 62,000, and we would have the working age population. Okay, or sorry, we would have the labor force if we were to take them away. So the labor force in this case, as I said, was 128,000. And we know the working age population, it's 250,000. And so the labor force participation rate is just going to be 128,000 divided by 250,000. So in this example, the labor force participation is quite low at only 51.2%. That would not be very good. We wouldn't like to see that, because if you think about it, only about half of the people who can work or are legally able to work are working. And you got to remember, the income of a country, its wealth is derived from the goods and services it produces. And if it's, not using much of its labor to do that, then the wealth could be lower. This is also the group that is, the tax base for the government. This is going to be the source of revenue for the government in terms of providing education, possibly healthcare, and other public goods. What's the unemployment rate? Well, we know the number of people who are unemployed here is 8,000. Okay, and that's because we're told it's 8,000 are looking for work. And so the labor force is also 128,000. So we know the two numbers we need to calculate the unemployment rate. So we take the 8,000 divided by the 128,000 and we get 6.25%. Okay, next problem. This one's a little complicated, but it helps us understand the incidence and duration of unemployment. Suppose there's 25,000 people and they're unemployed. They just become unemployed. And we have some data. Maybe this was historical data, and think of these as maybe estimates. And so this data tells us that during the first month, the exit rate out of unemployment is 60%. So you have 25,000 people. Within the first month, 60% of them will leave the unemployment state, so they're going to get a job. Next month, at the end of next month, of the remaining people, 20% will leave. And then the third month, of the remaining people after that, 20%. But by the end of the 6 months, all of 25,000 people will have got a job. Okay, so there's no one unemployed longer than 6 months. So the first question is, how many unemployment months will the 25,000 unemployed workers experience? Okay, well, for this question, it's useful to basically outline what's going on every month in terms of the numbers of people leaving and staying. So at the beginning, there's 25,000 people unemployed. So in the first month, 15,000 will exit. That's the 60% of the 25,000. And the remainder, 10,000, will remain unemployed. Okay? And so after the first month, there were 15,000 months of people being unemployed. Okay? So we say months for duration 15,000. These people are also unemployed, but we still don't know how long they're going to be unemployed for. So at the end of the first month, there were 15,000 people, 15,000 months of being unemployed. You're just taking 15,000 times it by 1 month. Okay, so the 25,000 workers will experience. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead here, but that's for the first month. At the end of the second month, we have 2,000 that will exit, and so then we have 4,000 months, and then the next month we have 1,600 exited the unemployment state, so we multiply that by 3, 1,280 multiplied by 4, and so on. And after the 6th month, there's no more people that are unemployed. So overall, if we add up this column, we're going to get the total months of unemployment. So the 25,000 workers will experience 58,616 months of unemployment. Oh, my mistake. You add up this column here. Okay? So we add up this column, and we get the 58,616. And so on average, if we take that and divide it by 25,000, on average, people are unemployed for 2.34 months. Now it's asking what fraction of persons who are unemployed are long-term unemployed, in that their unemployment spells last 5 months or more. Okay, so we know that in the 5th month, 1,024 will get a job, and at the end of the 6th month, 4,096. So if you look, if you sum these two numbers, this is the number of people that were unemployed for 5 months or longer. And if you take that and divide it by 25,000, you get that represents about 20% of the workers have unemployment spells lasting 5 or more months. Next question asks, just in terms of the unemployment months, what can be attributed to the long-term unemployed? Well, we know that in terms of months of unemployment, that's going to be this number plus this number, and then we're just going to divide that by the 58,616. And so basically, out of all of the months of people being unemployed, roughly 50% are for long term. So 29,696 divided by 58,616 is 50.7%. Now the last question says, what is the nature of the unemployment problem in this example? Is it too many workers losing their jobs, or too many long spells? What do you think? Well, clearly many workers, have short-lived unemployment. Like right off the bat, 60% of the unemployed return to work. However, the big issue here is the length. There's a lot of people still unemployed in the 6th month. Okay, so the main problem is here is a large portion have very long unemployment spells, and you can see the number here, 24,576. This is the number of months unemployed when you're thinking of the 6th month, because there's 4,096 people, and they were all unemployed for 6 months. Okay, so when you multiply that, you're getting this large number here. Okay, so let's do some multiple choice questions. The unemployment rate is expressed as, okay, this one's very easy. It is the number of unemployed workers divided by the size of the labor force. Again, always just think you have your labor force. What's the proportion of that labor force that is unemployed? That's your unemployment rate. You multiply it by 100 to get it in percent. Hidden unemployment, what does that refer to? What do you think? Okay, the answer is C. It's jobless and becomes so discouraged that they drop out of the labor market. And so since they're not in the unemployment statistics, that's why we call them hidden. Which of the following statements concerning the incidence of unemployment is true? Okay, I'll give you a second. What do you think? Okay, so the answer is B. If you remember that table that we looked at that showed different age groups, the incidence tends to be concentrated among workers in certain demographics. When we saw, for one, young workers tend to have a very high incidence rate. The next question, workers become unemployed when all of the following events occur except, okay, which one is the exception? Okay, of course the answer is E. To be considered unemployed, you need to be actively seeking work. This says not actively seeking work. Okay, and next question. Suppose that each month 2% of employed workers lose their jobs and 15% of unemployed workers find jobs. So we have our S, lowercase s, and lowercase f. What would the natural rate of unemployment be? Well, we take S and divide it by S plus F, and we would get 11.8%. Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the course, and have a great day.